Wow, what a chapter to come back from break on, and what a great chapter to start for my channel. Weekly chapter review and analysis video, starting with this week's One Piece Manga Chapter 1054, titled 4 Emperors. Now, as jam-packed as this chapter was, we really only had like 3 scenes and 3 separate kind of interactions, which we're going to go over. We're not going to go over them in order, but I want to start on this cover page, because this double page spread of the wanted poster for Luffy and then Blackbeard and Buggy and Shanks all together might be one of my favorite cover spreads that we've gotten ever. It's so different than every single cover spread that we've gotten for all of the first chapter, the chapter to start the time after the time skip. All of those chapters had, featured the Straw Hat Pirates all together and Luffy making an X and all this stuff. Well, this chapter cover, starting the final saga according to Oda and the Shonen Jump and everything, doesn't resemble a cover spread I can even think of, which is really, really cool. But I also think it was kind of meant to highlight just how weird this chapter is a little bit, considering that we don't even see one member of the Straw Hat Pirates in this entire chapter. At least officially, not counting Yamato. And now to get this review started for real, I think I have to start talking about the moment we've kind of all been waiting for, which is Shanks' big reappearance back into the story. And we got that this chapter, but I just think a lot of things were really, really weird and pointing to a lot of clues about things maybe going on with Shanks, which I actually have a video coming out Tuesday or Wednesday. It's going to be called something like, There's Something Wrong with Shanks. But this chapter, really, I haven't really seen a whole lot of people touch on it, but there are some obvious clues and oddities throughout this chapter that something is weird with Shanks. When we first meet them, obviously we get the Yasopp saying he's not ready to meet Usopp, which, we already knew was probably a bad dad. Yaso means antisocial in a bunch of languages. Not a great guy, most likely. That's obvious. And in chapter 1054, when Shanks' scenes start, Lucky Roo wants to go back to meet Luffy. I wonder if it's because he wants to eat him. But the very first shot we see the Jolly Roger flag with the 3 or 4 cuts, triangles in the edge of the flag. Reminds me very much of the mountains we kept seeing in the Bartolomeo cover stories, but we'll touch on that. But this shot right here is extremely interesting. Keep this shot in mind and we'll come back to it. Now, when we cut into Shanks reading the paper and kind of reminiscing about the past and thinking about things, one, since he's looking at Luffy in his Gear 5 form, and he's thinking about when they stole the Gum Gum fruit, it really makes me believe that Shanks, maybe the crew didn't, but Shanks most likely knew that this was the Nika fruit. It wasn't the Gum Gum fruit. And I think that there's lots of stuff going on here, including the fact that when questioned by his crew about if they should attack the Navy or the CP9 ship to get the fruit or whatever, Shanks answers, "Who cares? Let's go." And then the top word bubbles, the arrow points to his eyeball, and then the second word bubble arrow points to his tooth. I do not think that is on accident. And then another thing I think is always so weird to me is that everyone that ever sees Luffy and notices and recognizes the straw hat knows that he got it from Shanks. Yet everyone who ever talks to Shanks in the past always calls him Red Hair Shanks, even though he wore the straw hat, presumably most of his life after being at least on Roger's ship until chapter 1. Yet he's always referred to as Red Hair ship, as the Red Hair Pirates, Red Hair Shanks, including the, Luffy's the Straw Hat Pirates, all this stuff. Wouldn't it have been like the Straw Hat Pirates in chapter 1 for Shanks' crew? Except they were the Red Hair Pirates. Just always struck me as weird. And another thing that's always weird to me is how often that the Jolly Roger flag for the Red Hair Pirates changes. In chapter 1, it changes shot to shot. The page before this, we saw the mouth was closed. It also had 5 teeth in the top and bottom. Here, the mouth is open, and it kind of looks like there's only 4 teeth there. I would say that there is 4 teeth there. Now, if we go back to the flag that's shown when Shanks shows up at Marineford, that skull only has 4 teeth in the top and 4 teeth on the bottom. So, a little bit weird. I think there's lots of stuff going on with teeth and feet and clothes. And speaking of clothes, on the next page of the flashback, we see Luffy coming towards Shanks while they're in the party's bar. Well, when you flip this picture upside down, shout out to my friend Den Kushi who found this and put it on Discord. When you turn her shirt upside down, the ba music note symbol shirt that Luffy's wearing looks like a devil fruit without the spiral stem on the top. But what's even crazier than that is something I really haven't seen anyone else say anything about, but Maybe it's just because I've read chapter 1 a billion times and studied every single panel of it. But in this picture, in this panel where Shanks is saving Luffy from the Sea King, in no iteration from the prototype or chapter 1, The Romance Dawn for One Piece, Shanks never wears his black cape in any version or any time that he goes into the water to save Luffy. Never once. Why does he remember wearing his black cape while saving Luffy here? Perhaps it's because I really think there's a lot going on here to the idea that every single thing in this moment is for us to kind of believe stuff about Shanks. He's kind of making up memories as he goes along here. Almost like he's rediscovering them while reading the paper. And we're getting the straw hat in the sun and the dawn. All sorts of stuff here, I think, being implanted. And then I think it's really interesting that no one on the crew has ever heard about any of these stories of Shanks' past of meeting Luffy. Seems like he told Mihawk, seems like he told, White Bear, all these people, but has never told the lesser members of his crew, I guess. And then we get a pretty ominous shot of Shanks saying that he's not planning on having his reunion with Luffy here in Wano, which to me just speaks volumes to just how much that the Shanks and the red hair pirates might have manipulated and planned out things on a grand universal scale for the One Piece world. But it's very interesting to me what he says next. He says we have to deal with what's going on in our backyard, and that because 𝚲𝚘𝚡 has kind of caused trouble in his territory. And he says we'd be failing our duties if we just let that slide. Now, what could Shanks' duties possibly be? Well, the only other person we've ever seen kind of barge into Mary Joa and talk to people and make demands was Jean Lafayette. And Jean Lafayette is the only character that I'm aware of that was labeled a sheriff. And I think that there's a lot going on in the One Piece world, obviously, but the idea that Shanks has been, not letting certain people go past a certain point in the Grand Line, a sort of a Sheriff of Mulberry, maybe. I don't think that is too outlandish or far-fetched to read into here. And then we get Shanks sitting down for Ben Beckman to pour him a drink, and he tells Ben Beckman that isn't it about time to go and claim it, the One Piece. So to me, at the very least, this definitely kind of hints at the idea that Shanks has been waiting for lots of stuff. Now, I know there's lots of ideas around that he's been waiting for Luffy and all this stuff, and he has been, but not in any way that the community, I think, has kind of said. I think there's going to be a lot of uncomfortable truths in the future, and I think one of them is that our concept of the One Piece treasure and what Rogers said was, like Shanks thinking of this flashback in this chapter, all completely made up, and I think that this last panel here where it fades into black and kind of nothingness is what a lot of the treasure things that people have been searching for in the One Piece world ultimately amounts to. Nothing. Now, the numbers on the sake bao I'm going to touch on in my video next week, so I'm not going to go into them major here. I do think that there's huge clues with 617, 716, 719, all that stuff. But considering that this chapter spoke about 𝚲𝚘𝚡, let's look at that chapter, his chapter cover story real quickly. Now, in the cover for chapter 873, A Recipe for Disaster, and he notices that Shanks' pirate flag is there and that he has invaded Shanks' territory. Now, subsequently, he goes on to burn down that pirate flag and replace it with Luffy's. But in this chapter, now this skull's another weird skull that has way more teeth than we've ever seen for a Shanks flag before. This is what I meant when I was saying it reminded me of those mountains. The flags, the 3 mountains in the back, really makes me question where this territory is. But what I think is the biggest clue, and it relates exactly to this chapter. Remember when I said to remember that panel where we saw Shanks' sword present in his shadowy silhouette while he was overlooking the outside and coast of Wano? That shadow of the sword is the only time that we see the sword this chapter. Every other shot where we should see it, it's not there, including the flashback at some scenes where you think it might be there with, well, that cover page that I'm talking about, that 873, the SBS across from it actually brings up Shanks and gives the name of what his sword is, which is Griffon. No, not that Griffith, but Griffon. I think there's a whole bunch of stuff going on with the idea of what a griffin is, but for this chapter specifically, the name Griffin is the name of the Invisible Man from H.G. Wells' 1897 science fiction novel, The Invisible Man, and the future, Universal Monsters movies and all that stuff. I think that the idea that Shanks' sword is invisible, especially considering there's been some funny clues with some interviews between Oda and Masashi Kishimoto from Naruto talking about invisible characters and such. I think that this is a huge clue to stuff going on with Shanks' sword and all sorts of hidden meanings and things going on behind the scenes of this ship. But like I said, I'm going to get more into that in my next video. I think that the idea that Shanks has been waiting for certain ingredients and keys to get together so that the One Piece can actually be claimed or used or something could be a very real possibility. But for now, like the rest of the in-universe One Piece world, let's talk about Sabo. I always find the new Navy headquarters to be so funny looking. It just reminds me of a McDonald's sign. And I really can't help but think that that's a huge clue to the idea that one, I think, interpretation of what sad could represent or mean is a standard American diet and being fed poison. Along the same lines of being fed poison, I think we're about to get fed a bunch of lies here in this scene, just like pretty much it seems like most of this chapter. Akainu, Kizaru, and a new character, Karuma, or Tensei, meaning the Black Horse, who's the Navy Criminal Affairs Unit Chief, and they're all discussing the recent events dealing with the Reverie. Now, I don't know too much of what to make of this Karuma guy yet, but I will say the idea that we're specifically told that he's a chief, and knowing that Shanks is always referred to as chief, I think kind of ties back into this idea that I think the idea that there's only been 4 emperors and not a hidden 5th hand kind of holding and moving things. Perhaps the structures that we've known as the power sources of the One Piece world, the 4 Yonko, the 3 pillars and all these things, that there may be 4, 5, or 6, hidden kind of tentacle hands behind the scenes pulling the strings. Well, I think it's very interesting what's said here about how they were held back because they were in the Holy Land. The admirals weren't able to fight fully because they were in the Holy Land or whatever. Going back to something I was touching on in my chapter retrospectives, I believe that the reason Momo's fruit was deemed a failure is because it doesn't have the normal devil fruit weaknesses. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of this review. But I think for the Marines, if they were trying to create weapons that they could use and control around the world, the best way to do that would be to have fail-safes and weaknesses built in. Almost like you're purposely building in the weakness of the Death Star, essentially, with every devil fruit you create. Well, I think that maybe one of the limitations is that certain, models of fruit, certain eras of fruits, devil fruits, batches, won't work at the Holy Land of Marijoa. I think that there's something about that they can turn off their powers or make them take over the will of the fruit, something along those lines, and that's why the admirals were not useful there. Now, I think that's one idea, but considering what I think's going on, I don't totally think that that was used here. Although I do think that that is a restriction and limitation we'll see in the future for devil fruits. I don't believe that was actually used here in the Marines, but let me explain. We get this shot of the paper, and again we kind of see that the top of the paper is cut up a lot like Shanks's Jolly Roger flag, but we see on the newspaper page that Sabo has assassinated King Cobra. So let's talk about that for a second, because we know that that's most likely not in Sabo's character. Of course, perhaps now that we know all this stuff with the devil fruits and wills and everything, he could have perhaps been controlled and taken over by his devil fruit. I think that's one possibility. But I think that it's actually much, much more sinister. So, King Cobra has been assassinated. He's dead. We knew he was sickly. Let's just go for a second that maybe when Cobra went to go talk to the Gorosei, perhaps he had a request. Perhaps he had a request for a new body. Because of the truly realistic possibilities that I think are going on here. One, I think that Sabo and Vivi may have fused but I don't think that happened, and I don't think it's going to happen yet. But looking at this this explosion caused destroying the monument of the divine dragon claw. Now remember, Sabo's techniques were all claw-based at Dressrosa, but this really made me kind of think of the pose in the smoke here of Mr. 3 and all of his like flamingo dancing ballet poses. So I think that's one possibility. But what I think is much more likely is that Cobra has actually taken over Sabo's body. Now, Sabo is kind of a crazy name because it's not really much of a name. The main thing that it makes me think of and has always made me think of is sabotage. The idea of Luffy being sabotaged by Sabo, I think, in some realm could be being hinted at here. But what I think is most likely with Sabo's name is the fact that we can move around the letters to make the anagram boas. Boas, cobras, all snakes, all these things. And now you have to check out my Poneglyphs Are a Trap video for more on this stuff. But I think that the idea that perhaps the Ancient Kingdom and other rebellion type forces are constantly being infiltrated by the Marines and spies and placed in high up positions in these organizations to keep them stagnant, okay? The idea that it's been 20 years since Roger started the Great Age of Piracy and not anything has been done. If anything, it was just a stalemate for 20 odd years. I think by design and on purpose, by the Marines and maybe the world government and maybe higher up and maybe Emu and maybe higher up than that. And I think that there's a lot of crazy stuff going on with Cobra, including that he's maybe not Vivi's biological father. But even not thinking about all that stuff, I definitely think that Vivi is with Sabo. When we see this whole crowd cheering for Sabo in the revolution, we get some, to me, a pretty clear Vivi flag on the banners. But there's definitely something off. And I'm not just saying that because there's this weird sword here that's missing its tip here. They keep calling him the Flame Emperor. Now, for the One Piece and Japan in general, there's lots of geographical myths and ideas and geopolitical struggles between China, Japan, Vietnam, Papua New Guinea, way in the south, all those areas. And many myths kind of correlate to those 4 points kind of being the 4 sections of the world for lots of old myths. When it comes to the Flame Emperor, that is what the Yan Emperor was called for the leader of the Sheep's Head Mountains was what it was called, the north of Baoji in the Shanks Shaanxi province at the homeland territory of China. Okay? Now that Sheep's Head Mountain thing is very interesting because just earlier in this chapter, Luffy's shirt had a fruit on it that said Ba. And especially in the ancient past, you know, you don't need to do a very deep dive into world affairs to see kind of some of the atrocities and tensions that have mounted across time and at various times in that area between these kind of 4 ends of the world, geographically speaking, for that area. And with China being the biggest country over there and the largest territory with the most people and the biggest military, and the idea that the great big red line could be the border of China from kind of controlling the borders and dictating who can go in and out of the mainland China into Europe and all those areas. Pretty much the border into what would be considered the New World if you were Japan, I think is hugely symbolically resonant in the story in all sorts of facets. And this Flame Emperor thing, I think, is just one huge clue to that idea and kind of the hidden power structures that kind of control the One Piece world, and maybe a little taste of how they've been able to actually do that and keep that control for so long in the One Piece universe, is this idea of infiltrating any sort of rebellious unit that could possibly start to grow. So yeah, basically when it comes to Sabo, to me, the 2 main ideas are, one, that his fruit took over and that he killed Cobra and stole Vivi, I guess, or Vivi joined him, and something along those lines. Or what I think is much more likely is that has been, in a sense, poisoned by Cobra in order to eventually sabotage Luffy in some way or the revolution, basically to keep the powers that be in the One Piece world in power. I think Cobra's kind of started that poisonous IV drip into the lifeblood of the revolutionaries. So basically, Sabo has been sabotaged and is being, boa constricted on the inside by Cobra taking over. Maybe even going through the fire fruit in some form. We did meet Ace and learn about the flame fruit in the Alabasta arc right before we met Cobra. It was a couple chapters before we met Cobra actually for the first time. So to me, this idea, and then going back to this idea that it might not be his biological father, if we actually take a close look at Cobra, every single love interest that Vivi's had, he has immediately sent away from the kingdom. Vivi seemed to really like that Koza guy, the leader of the rebels as a child. As soon as that relationship was kind of fully made aware to Cobra, that maybe a relationship could be starting to blossom between Vivi and Koza, Cobra sends the kid and his family away to go dig for water that was most likely not there. In the middle of the desert. Literally said, oh, you like my daughter? Well, I'm gonna send you to the desert to find an oasis. And then maybe, then maybe you'll be worthy to court my daughter or something along those lines. But really what I think it is was probably Cobra just kind of getting a suitable match for Vivi out of his hair. I say that kind of jokingly, but I think that is happening on multiple levels in crazy ways that no one has talked about. And that's what my video next week's going to be about with Shanks and everything and tying into all this stuff. But for now, the idea that lots of characters in the One Piece world are getting motivated by perhaps acquiring marriage dowries. And what I mean by that is just certain requirements that need to be met in order for a marriage proposal to be accepted. And all the multiple forms that plot could take and present itself into the story during the One Piece endgame. But for right now, I really think that there's a lot going on with the idea that Sabo's kind of been body snatched. And even when we look at this spread of stuff, it's a recreation of, that crowd screaming scene that we've seen many times. Open the manga, Brook did it with his, to open the time skip, and then we get here. We've literally gotten pretty much this scene in the first chapter of every part 1, part 2, and then the final act of One Piece so far. So very fitting that we get it here. And then I guess for this review, we're going to end the chapter where it began, with Ryogoku kind of attacking or beginning his descent into Wano. I really liked how it looked with Ryogoku walking towards the flower capital of Wano, and he has the flowers growing out of his feet. I thought that was a very cool effect. And then I really liked the application of his powers. I really kind of liked this flexing force muscle thing and all this stuff. And that his fruit was a Logia. All of these shots, I just kind of kept thinking to myself, like, broccoli head. And then looking at his body and all this stuff, this dude's pretty much Broly. Broly, broccoli, that's where the name comes from for Broly. And considering I really think that we're in the Dragon Ball Z fusion stage kind of thing, or about to be, I'm not surprised that this guy looks so much like Broly. I think there's lots of things going on in Wano, and this ability to sway others was touched on at the very first page by Ryogoku. Well, I think that is on a fundamental level happening all the time throughout the manga with every single line of the manga drawn by Oda. One of the, I think a big indication of that is that Momo is able to use part of Gear 5 here while he runs. The way that Momo is spinning his legs in a circle to run is very reminiscent of Luffy's Gear 5. And that makes a lot of sense because in Wano it seems like Luffy's kind of been rubbing off on the place the entire time. Even Chopper's special Rumble Ball medicine thing that he made for Zoro during the Onigashima raid, the side effect was the exact same side effect that Luffy experienced when he first started using Gear 3. Essentially, it's as if Luffy has become an eraser that just seems to rub off on all the things and places and people he seems to touch and meet and ultimately influence. And then we get some kind of, to me, there's lots of stuff going on with Robin, and the last chapter before this month-long break was mainly Robin-centric as far as the information went with finding out crazy things about Pluton and everything. Well, I think there's a lot going on, especially with the flower capital in the background and her being the flower fruit. We get Ryogoku pretty much using Robin's technique here to capture Momo and crack his back. It's literally the same exact thing, just instead of with like human limbs like Robin uses, this is with trees that seem to be stronger maybe because they can pull down a dragon. But I think what's most important with this whole part is how desperate it seems Momo does not want Yamato to interact or be caught by the Marines. And considering that she's an ice wolf, and I think that there's lots of clues throughout the series of a snow queen or a snow princess or something being maybe in power or what Emu ultimately is, going back to the kind of Cobra thing, I think there's lots of people trying to body snatch and get new eternal youth bodies and stuff like that, and I really wonder if Emu's been after one special white wolf that was in a country that's far, far away and locked away, and that she maybe has been waiting for that to reappear in some way, and perhaps that could be why, or related to something that Momo knows and is desperate to make sure doesn't happen when it comes to the Marines and the world government, and why maybe they are so adamant about getting inside of the Wano borders, getting inside of what's in Wano. And that's gonna do it for our first review, weekly review, I guess, of chapter 1054 of One Piece. Like I said, I'll be coming out with a Shanks-centric video next week, but I'm also starting a podcast this weekend with a dude named 𝙲𝚘𝚙𝚎𝚘𝚡, and it's going to be called Side Piece Sundays, and in that we're going to further elaborate on theories and stuff that we're seeing in weekly chapters, as well as cover other topics, and I will drop a link to his channel down below, so please check that out and tune into to all that on Sunday. I'll be further elaborating on some of the ideas that we didn't touch on enough in this video. But my name is 𝙲𝚘𝚙𝚒𝚆. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please like, share, subscribe, and all that stuff. Comment what you thought and noticed in the chapter. I'm sure I didn't see everything. And we also didn't even talk about looking through any of the light stuff. So we'll get to that stuff probably on the podcast a little bit, but definitely in future videos. So my name is 𝙲𝚘𝚙𝚒𝚆. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.